On the line, I have Keith Rankin, who is a lecturer of accounting and finance from Unitech. So welcome to Raglan Community Radio.
Good morning.
So for me, I get a little bit frustrated with the discussion in the mainstream media about economics. It seems, from my perspective, seems too simplistic. I use the example of beneficiaries as a case. People always talk about we can't afford to pay benefits to these people, and they talk about it as if we're pouring the money into a hole in the ground.
Yes.
But we know that it's actually, obviously, people on benefits pretty much spend their money right away. So if we just stop paying benefits tomorrow, what effect would that have on the economy?
Well, it would launch us into a recession and possibly a major depression. It's interesting, if we look back at the Great Depression of the 1930s, the countries that did really best then were the countries that had welfare systems. Because in the Great Depression, when people cut back on their spending, what it meant was that a lot of people lost work. But if people went from work into some kind of benefit system, what it meant was that people continued to spend, they continued to pay their bills, they continued to at least enjoy the basics of life. And that meant that the grocery shops and all the local services and all that in the different towns retained their businesses rather than going broke. And so in those bad times, they were relatively shallow in those countries. But countries like the United States was one, Germany was another, France was another. They had almost no welfare systems, and so people just stopped spending. Like in France in the 1930s, people just went back to the countryside and lived off the land, or there were a lot of immigrants from Africa who just went back to Africa. And so the spending within that economy just really collapsed in ways that it didn't in countries like Sweden and UK that had benefit systems. And so it was really, really very hard for those countries to get out of that depression.
Yeah, so that's very different to the way that we do talk about it in the mainstream in New Zealand. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but it does make a lot of sense. So, is there a way we could ever get that discussion round to this common sense idea that the economy is about the money going round?
Well, it's mainstream economics, especially since the 1930s. The Keynesian economics that developed then was really about making sure that there was enough, that the money was going around in a way that facilitated people buying stuff. Because if the money stops going around, people stop spending, then you're in a race to the bottom, the economy collapses. So it's getting money to people who need goods and services, because that's what the economy is about, is providing goods and services for people. And that's when Keynes, who was the greatest economist in the 20th century in the world, did most of his writing. And he pointed out that and the kind of situations we had then, they were demand constrained, and that the only way forward was by making sure that people, especially those in need, continued to be able to spend. It's mainstream. It's when we teach economics, important parts of what we always teach is Keynesian macroeconomics. It's never gone off the prescription at all. It's just that journalists and politicians and that seem to have a different view of economics from basic first-year textbook economics.
I guess if journalism is dominated by the neoliberal view, I guess we're not getting to even hear from economists who talk about anything other than the neoliberal approach.
I guess so. And what we had this thing that happened in New Zealand, but it was worldwide in the late 70s, or early 80s, or even mid 80s in New Zealand, where there used to be a consensus. I use the word equitarian because both the National and the Labour Party, since the time of Michael Savage in the late 1930s, had a view that everybody was basically equal, and that in our public lives, which are a substantial part of our lives, we were equal and had equal rights to access and participate in society and so on, and that the underlying way we managed that was we had fairly high tax rates, but we gave something back to everybody. So it was the idea that the private economy was really important, but all the public infrastructure and resources and environment and all of that went into making the private economy was was really important, and that meant that we had to have higher tax rates than what we commonly think are appropriate today, but that everybody got something back. And when you do it that way, the maths is actually pretty simple. But since the 1980s, we went in this neoliberal direction, and it was compounded by the left-wing party driving it. And that meant that it just drove the other party with it to the right. And so the shift was then to just having low taxes and having very, very targeted benefits. So the bureaucracy became horrendous because you had to be very grudging to give people benefits. And so it was universalism sort of against targeting. And the universal system really worked really well, but there's two sides to it. One side is that everybody gets something, but the other side is that tax rates have to be higher. And it's two sides of one coin.
So I guess the main thing I keep hearing people say, and I see it in comments again, is, well, we just can't afford to pay benefits anymore.
Yeah.
And
we can't afford not to pay them.
You can't afford not to.
When we don't, that's when the economy really starts slowing down and even grinding to a halt.
I guess the fact that most people on benefits, they are probably living a relatively hand-to-mouth existence. As soon as they get the money, they spend it again. Is that quite important as well, part of the process?
Absolutely. It's not only people on benefits. It's not 100% true, because a lot of people on benefits are in substantial debt as well.
Right.
Because often the benefits are not enough, and whenever uneven things happen in our lives, a fairly regular but very low level of income isn't enough. So most people on low incomes, whether working or on benefits, have also got, or a lot of people have got a fair amount of debt, with wages being very low. We actually often lend money to us to spend rather than pay us better wages and so on. So debt becomes an issue, and if you're repaying debt, then in fact you're not spending all of your income, you're actually having to commit some of it to paying that debt, even though your income is quite low. So it's not necessarily true that low-income people spend all their income, but we would rather that they had a reasonable amount of income and kept their debt levels under check, rather than having to go down the debt route. The welfare state route is a much better route.
Okay. Now, I had an interesting experience a few years ago. It was Christmas Day, and I was at my parents' house, and it was sort of late, it was the afternoon, and there wasn't much happening. And I noticed on the shelves that there are a couple of autobiographies by Robert Muldoon,
yes,
former Prime Minister, and
yes,
and I've just idly picked up the book and randomly opened it, and in the pages there, he was talking about the velocity of money.
Yes,
is important, and I thought, that's interesting. I haven't heard anyone talk about this ever in my adult life, but here he is, the one who was supposed to have stuffed New Zealand up,
yes,
talking about that. So what was he meaning by the velocity of money?
Basically, the economy works through the circulation of money so that we get paid in money that we can spend, and it means that we don't just have to barter and things like that. But money in itself probably isn't that important, but it's a social technology, and for money to work in society, it has to flow through society, and it's that spending that's really important. And when we stop spending it, and if we pay a few people massive amount of money that they can't spend, for example, then the flow of money starts to, it's like someone who's about to get a heart attack when the arteries are getting blocked.
Yeah.
It's that flow of money through the system that really matters. And if the system's working well, then if the velocity is fine, then you don't need to have so much money. But what happened after the global financial crisis is that everyone wanted to hold their savings in the form of money. And that meant you had to have more money, but the money flowed much more slowly. So a lot of people panicked and thought we're going to get this mass inflation when central banks started producing a lot more money. But it was just a way of people parking their wealth, and the flow of money was really, really slow then. It's become a lot more quick in the last 2 or 3 years. But it's one of those things that, as the cycle goes, money flows through quickly as people spend it, and as people lend it a lot more. But then people start to get very cautious, and including the banks getting really cautious, and then the flow of money slows down, people spend less, and then we go back into recession or something like that.
So it's interesting you mentioned that how they were making new money or printing money, as it's commonly known.
Yeah.
Why didn't it lead to high inflation? Was it because they did the right amount, or what is it?
Well, just having money doesn't compel people to spend. We spend when based on our incomes, and if we need to spend more, we borrow. But as I was saying, what was happening is that a lot of people they had their savings and various different kind of assets and things like that, but then they all panicked, and they wanted to be able to just put their money just in the bank, or to sell a lot of those assets that they realised were falling in value. And in New Zealand, the houses didn't fall that much, but in many other countries, house prices fell by 20 or 30%. So there was a panic to sell. There's panic to sell shares and a lot of these other big financial derivatives and sort of mortgage-based bonds and things like that. Everyone was in a panic to sell them back in the global financial crisis, and they just wanted to hold money. They didn't want to spend it or anything. And so it was really important just to have that money in the system, but people, it didn't impel them to spend. It was just a way of parking their savings. So simply having money doesn't in itself make people spend. Okay,
so it really is about, it's about avoiding panics by the sound of it.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
That comes to the core of it. It was interesting that while the US and I think the EU were printing money, Russell Norman here in New Zealand suggested we do something similar. I think it was to spend some money into the economy through the Christchurch earthquake or something.
Yes.
And he was laughed out of town by the local media, but I didn't see anyone point out, well, hold on, that's what the US is doing and the EU is doing.
Yeah, no, it's I find that quite strange that even ideas that are widely talked about in terms of doing things a little bit differently to what we have done over the last 20 years meet a much more receptive audience, and certainly in the UK and many places than they do here, and it's hard to explain why. It's part of this consensus that developed after the 1980s, and most of the people in the media don't really know much about what New Zealand was like before the time of Rogernomics, and so the whole discussion is based on this narrow consensus, where things like that are just seen as incredulous without really any serious thought about them. In the case of New Zealand, the policy probably wasn't particularly necessary because we still had interest rates around 2 to 3%, whereas these other countries, their interest rates were around between 0% and 0.5%. So the situations in the United States, Japan, and the UK were not the same, but certainly in the European Union, they were very begrudging about printing money, as you call it, and the situation in Europe could have been much worse if they eventually hadn't come to that party.
Well, we did see a few countries in the south of Europe are still in a lot of trouble because of restrictions on their money, aren't they? They've gone for the austerity approach.
Yes. And it's a little bit complex, but it's a little bit not complex. The whole thing was misunderstood as a sovereign debt crisis, but it was actually a big crisis within the Eurozone, because what happened is that without being able to devalue their currency, countries in the north were just exporting large amounts to the countries in the south, but not importing in return. When they started coming up with this austerity solution, it wasn't really about money. It was all about saying you've just got to get all your costs way down. And in order for countries like Greece and Italy and Spain to be able to export huge amounts to countries like Germany, I think the way they could do it was by slashing their wages and by having quite significant deflation. But that means when you do that, you don't have any spending in your internal economy. So what Greece has been through is something significantly worse than what New Zealand suffered in the Great Depression, and it's still happening. Greece's economy is still declining from 2008, and they have deflation, but business confidence is still incredibly weak. They've got 27% unemployment, and about 60% of young people are unemployed. It's worse than the Great Depression was in New Zealand.
I don't know. To me, it seems self-evident that if you cut all your spending within your economy, there's not going to be much money to go around. How does this austerity idea get there in the first place? And how do grown men and women who are running the country take it seriously? Well,
part of the sort of neoliberal idea is that it's really dangerous if the government gets too big. And a lot of this came out of ideas in the 17th, in Europe in the 17th and 18th century, where people were really, and governments weren't democratic in those days, and governments were often fairly corrupt and so on, and people really worried about the size of government. And that's why people don't reverted back from Keynesian economics, because if the solution is for governments to spend more or governments to pay more benefits, which is seen as the government getting bigger, then this sort of leviathan of big government sort of looms over everything, and that's the kind of panic that these people get into. And so what they're kind of saying is, if we lean too much to the government, if the government gets too big, it crowds out the private sector. But when the private sector is completely and utterly spent and has no confidence to do anything, what the private sector really wants is the government to be their customer.
Right.
So in New Zealand in the late 1930s, when the government State House program got going, the private sector got a huge boost because the government was the biggest customer of the private sector. The government paid the private sector to build lots of state houses.
So it's very different to what we conventionally hear. Look, Keith, I've run out of time here. It's been really good to talk to you. I've still got other questions I wanted to ask, particularly around our attitudes to debt and everything like that. So maybe we'll talk to you again some other time.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we could do that. But certainly debt is one of those things that we get in these sort of moral panics about. And debt is a really important part of any economy. We just need to not panic about it and just understand its place in our economy.